Until the mid-1800s, Japan had very limited foreign relations. The period is before this, from 1639, when the shoguns issued a mandate that no Japanese could come or go from the Japanese islands, and restricted foreigners to 1 or 2 ships a year, and it was just the Dutch who were allowed to come, and the Chinese and the Koreans. So the period from those kaikin, or maritime bans, issued in 1639 all the way up to the 1850s, when Commodore Perry came and a new status quo was negotiated, are sometimes misleadingly referred to as Japan's period of seclusion. The country wasn't secluded. They did have visitors coming. The Dutch regularly informed them about news from Europe. They were, in fact, ordered to write long, lengthy reports about what was going on in the world. And Chinese ships and Korean vessels were coming and going regularly in the port of Nagasaki. And so this was not a period when Japan was secluded, but it was oriented very carefully. Its channels to the outside world were narrowed and controlled. So we go from that kind of narrow aperture to the widening, the dramatic widening of that door, still controlled. In the 1850s, the treaties that were negotiated designated just a half a dozen treaty ports in which foreigners would be able to do their business. And their ability to move around the country was restricted. They had to have permits. They were not allowed to bring opium into Japan. So Japan actually was still able to restrict the activities of foreigners. But they did, for the first time in hundreds of years, negotiate formal diplomatic ties with a host of countries from the West as well as from the East. So this was a very dramatic change and a very unstable period when the Japanese, like many other countries, were jockeying for position, trying to figure out where they were going to end up in the international pecking order. And they saw, those who studied geography and studied world maps and geopolitics understood very quickly, broadly speaking, there were 2 kinds of countries in this international order that was suddenly knocking at their doors. Some were empires and some were colonies. And they sure didn't want to become a colony. And as a result, they decided they needed to acquire an empire. And they began very systematically moving toward doing that. I think one of the fascinating dynamics that's slowly becoming clear to historians is that one of the reasons for their success, one of the quiet background reasons for their success, is that the British, who were the dominant imperial power in the world at the time, gave them space to expand. It effectively allowed them to begin to seize territories to their north, to their south, and eventually to their west. I don't think they anticipated just how far the Japanese would go and how powerful they would become, but the Japanese were seen by the English by the British, I should say, as a useful barrier against the expansion of the Russian Empire, which was quite aggressively expanding eastward at the time and also was knocking on Japanese doors or coming into Japanese waters. So Japan found itself in a surprisingly fortunate position where it could play off these nearby aggressive powers against each other and find room for its own growth within that system. The engagement with the West, which was initially Europe, but by this time certainly included North America as well, started way back in the late 1500s and continued episodically and at Japanese rhythms and at Japanese discretion all through the Edo period. This is an interesting and important thing to note, that even during the period when it did not engage directly with or allow people from Europe to come into Japan, at least after 1720, books from Europe were allowed in. And books that explicitly promoted Christianity were seen as subversive and were kept out, but scientific books were allowed, medical books, geographical books, explanations of various phenomena in the world, these were allowed. And as a result, the Japanese, even before the mid-19th century, had been tinkering with microscopes and telescopes. They had been actually beginning to practice anatomy and had been studying anatomy books. Some of them had been exposed to some of the political tracts, although that was a little bit dicier, those were more limited, but certainly they'd been studying global geography. And ideas about the ordering of the world, ideas about races and peoples, this had all been coming in. By comparison with what would happen in the later 19th century, it looks like a trickle, because then the floodgates really opened and large numbers of books were translated from a variety of languages, not just from the Dutch or Chinese, but in fact, Japan became in turn a fountain for translated text to turn and enter China and Korea as well. The engagement was deep and broad. It's hard to characterize it in any definite way, but I would say there were many schools of thought, and many independent intellectuals found the room to pursue a variety of pathways. If you could learn a foreign language, that was the great entree and the key to being able to access things in the original. And for instance, in terms of literature, the engagement with Russian novels and Russian ideas, even revolutionary ideas, was actually absolutely formative for a certain literary culture in Japan. The Japanese do seem to have experienced a compressed entry into modernity relative to the Europeans. They went through, in about 50 years, an industrial revolution that had taken 2 centuries in the case of England, where it started. They weren't the only late developer to do this, to undergo a very rapid and compressed industrial revolution, but they certainly were one of the most notable in the world. And they were pretty successful at it. The question of why they embraced things like the railroad and the steamship as rapidly as they did and as enthusiastically as they did is one that has engaged many, many historians, both in Asia and outside. And I would say part of the answer certainly lies in the very strong foundations that were already laid during the Edo period. By 1868, when the Meiji Restoration actually took place and this industrial process really took hold, as state policy, right? They decided they wanted to build a strong state with a strong army. By that time, the Japanese already had a dense population. They were well educated by global standards, not again through state schooling, but through simply private academies in villages and towns all over the country. People wanted to educate their children and were beginning to find the wealth and the leisure to do it. They had a robust commercial network that extended all the way from one end of the country to the other. The sea lanes were its arteries, but there were well-developed roads as well. There was a great deal of cultural integration. One of the vehicles for that, by the way, and one of the things I love to emphasize when I teach about this to our students at Stanford, was a system called Sankin Kotai, or alternate residence, where the daimyo, the 260-some daimyo from all over Japan, had to spend every other year in the capital city. Well, when you're traveling back and forth regularly from the national capital to your home country, right? And they thought of it as a country out in the sticks. You're going to bring with you the tastes and the knowledge and the books and the accents and the jokes. Everything that's been circulating in the capital is going to diffuse out into the countryside. Not only that, but mendicant poets who wanted to make a living found that they could get on a circuit and travel from one castle town to another, and even out in rural villages could teach people. So they're spreading culture. In addition, people were starting to go on pilgrimage in large numbers, so people from the countryside are moving as well. So this, I realize I'm throwing us back into the pre-modern period, but I think this helps to build up a dense social, cultural, and ultimately even political web. People conceive of themselves as Japanese because they've begun to travel the archipelago, sometimes in practice bodily and sometimes in their imagination, through books, through prints, through the educational materials that they read. And that all helps to create the basis for a very vibrant embrace of modern communications technology, which in turn helps to build a consensus for industrialization. So there's a great foundation that had been laid, and add to that the sense of urgency, that if we don't do this quickly, we'll be overpowered by the powers. So one of the first things the Meiji government did was send observers on a 1.5-year trip around the world. It's kind of remarkable that a brand new government, still unshaky on its feet, and most of whose officials are young men in their 20s and 30s. They sent half of the government officials out of the country on relatively slow boats, not just to China, but all the way to across North America, across the Atlantic, through Europe. And by the time they came home, they had a very clear sense of what kind of investments they wanted to make and they felt they needed to make in order to become a power in this world. So that sense of urgency, the direct experience of travel to these foreign places, being impressed with the toys and technologies of the day, the very latest of the day, and having this educated populace, work-disciplined, already you've got the urban infrastructure built up, all of that, I think, facilitated a very rapid modernization.